The gunshot split the night air as Florence Crawford ducked behind the rain barrel, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She'd been running for 3 days straight, and Bandera, Texas, wasn't supposed to be the end of her journey, merely a stopping point. Yet here she was in 1875, trapped between the saloon and the general store with bounty hunters closing in. The wanted poster crumpled in her pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds, though the $500 reward for the mistress of mischief seemed almost laughable considering her crimes. "I know you're there, Miss Crawford," a gruff voice called out. "You can't hide forever." Florence pressed her back against the wooden wall, tears threatening to spill. 24 years old, and already her life had spiraled into something unrecognizable. She clutched the small leather pouch containing her meager savings, and the locket with her mother's portrait, the only things she had left of her former life. "Madam, you best come out now," another voice joined in, closer this time. A shadow fell across the alley, but it wasn't one of her pursuers. A tall figure on horseback appeared at the entrance, silhouetted against the dim light from the main street. Without hesitation, the rider extended a hand. "Get on," he said simply, his voice low and commanding. Florence hesitated only a second before making her decision. Death or capture waited if she stayed, and this stranger offered her only chance. She grabbed his hand and felt herself hoisted effortlessly onto the horse behind him. "Hold tight," he instructed as he spurred his horse forward, away from the voices now shouting in alarm. They thundered out of town, the midnight landscape of the Texas Hill Country opening before them. Florence clung to the stranger's waist, her face pressed against his back as they rode hard for what seemed like hours. Only when they reached a small creek did the rider slow to a trot and finally stop. "You can breathe now," he said, dismounting and offering his hand to help her down. In the moonlight, Florence got her first clear look at her rescuer. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean frame. His face was partially obscured by several days' worth of stubble, but she could make out striking blue eyes under the brim of his hat. He wore simple trail clothes, dusty denim, a worn cotton shirt, and a leather vest with a gun belt slung low on his hips. "Owen Eastwood," he said simply, tipping his hat. "Most folks call me Owen." "Florence Crawford," she replied automatically, then winced. "Though I suspect you already knew that if you're from Bandera." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "I know when a lady's in trouble. Didn't need to know your name for that. Those men, they're bounty hunters. I figured as much." Owen knelt by the creek, filling a canteen. "Care to tell me what you're running from?" Florence hesitated. "Would you believe me if I said I was innocent?" Owen handed her the canteen. "Wouldn't be the first time someone's been wrongfully accused in these parts." She took a long drink. "It's a complicated story. Most worth telling are." He began gathering wood for a small fire. "We're far enough away to risk a little warmth. Those hunters won't track in the dark." As Owen built a small, carefully shielded fire, Florence studied him. There was something measured about his movements, a quiet confidence that spoke of years navigating the harsh realities of the frontier. "You're not from around here either," she observed. "Montana originally. Been drifting south the past few years." He settled across from her, the small flames casting flickering light across his features. "Found work where I could ranch hand, tracker, sometimes deputy when towns needed extra guns." "And what brought you to Bandera?" "Just passing through. Same as you, I suspect." Florence stared into the fire. "I was the daughter of a banker in St. Louis. Had everything a young lady could want: education, suitors, a future." Her fingers traced the outline of the locket in her pocket. "Then my father got involved with some unsavory investors. When things went wrong, they made him disappear." Owen's expression remained steady, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "They tried to force me to marry one of them to settle the debt," they said. "When I refused, they framed me for theft." She laughed bitterly. "I supposedly stole from the very bank my father built. The irony would be amusing if it hadn't cost me everything." "So you ran?" "I ran," she confirmed. "But everywhere I go, they find me. Those men back in town weren't lawmen, they work for Harrington, my father's former partner." Owen poked at the fire thoughtfully. "Seems to me Harrington wants more than just justice for some alleged theft." "He wants what he couldn't have," Florence said quietly. "Me." They fell silent for a moment, the crackling of the fire and the chorus of night insects the only sounds in the darkness. "Why help me?" she finally asked. "You don't know me. I could be exactly what they claim, a thief, a troublemaker." Owen lifted his gaze to meet hers. "I've lived long enough to recognize the difference between someone running from justice and someone running for their life." He stood up, stretching. "Get some rest. We'll move at first light. Where are we going?" "I have a small place about a day's ride from here." "Not much, but it's hidden enough that you can lay low while we figure out your next move." Florence questioned. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Unless you'd prefer to handle those bounty hunters on your own." Despite everything, Florence found herself returning his smile. "Thank you." Owen nodded and moved to check on his horse, leaving Florence to wonder at the strange turn her fortunes had taken. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to hope. The dawn brought with it a fine mist over the hills as Owen and Florence set out. They traveled carefully, avoiding main trails and keeping to the rougher country where trackers would have more difficulty following. Owen proved to be a man of few words, but was attentive to Florence's comfort, stopping when necessary and sharing his provisions without complaint. By mid-afternoon, the landscape had grown wilder, with limestone outcroppings and cedar-covered slopes that provided natural protection from prying eyes. Florence had never ventured this far into the hill country before, and found herself captivated by its rugged beauty despite her circumstances. "It's different from what I imagined," she admitted as they paused on a ridge overlooking a valley thick with live oaks. "I always thought Texas would be flat and barren." "Common mistake," Owen replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "These hills have been home to people seeking refuge for centuries. Apache, Comanche, Mexican settlers, and now folks like me who prefer distance from civilization." "And what are you refuging from, Mr. Eastwood?" Florence asked, immediately regretting her boldness. To her surprise, Owen didn't seem offended. "Same as most, I suppose. Expectations. The war changed things, changed me. Came back to find the world I knew had moved on without me." He adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun. "Found it easier to make my own way out here than try to fit back into a life that didn't exist anymore." Florence nodded, understanding more than she could express. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever stop running. Not all who wander are lost, Miss Crawford. Please call me Florence." Owen inclined his head. "Florence, then." They continued riding until the sun began its descent behind the western hills. Just as Florence was beginning to wonder how much further they had to go, they crested a hill to reveal a small valley tucked between protective ridges. A modest cabin stood near a spring-fed creek, with a corral and small barn nearby. The setting was so perfectly concealed that one could ride within 100 yards and miss it entirely. "It's not much," Owen said as they approached, "but it's peaceful." "It's wonderful," Florence breathed, taking in the simple beauty of the homestead. Owen helped her dismount before tending to his horse. The cabin, though small, was sturdily built of local limestone and cedar. Inside, Florence found it surprisingly comfortable, a single room with a stone fireplace, a bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves containing books, supplies, and a few personal items. "You can take the bed," Owen said from the doorway. "I'll sleep in the barn." "That hardly seems fair," Florence protested. "This is your home, and you're my guest." His tone made it clear the matter wasn't up for discussion. After a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, they sat outside as twilight painted the hills in deepening shades of purple and blue. Fireflies had begun to emerge, dotting the gathering darkness with their ephemeral light. "I have never seen so many stars," Florence said softly, gazing upward at the vast canvas of the night sky. In the cities, such celestial displays were dimmed by lamplight and smoke. Owen followed her gaze. "One advantage of being this far from anywhere you can see how big the world really is," he paused. "Makes your troubles seem a bit smaller sometimes." "I wish that were true," Florence sighed, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "But my troubles seem to follow me wherever I go." "They won't find you here," Owen assured her. "Not for a while, at least. And then what? I continue running until they catch me or until I'm too exhausted to run anymore." The desperation in her voice surprised even her. "I can never have a normal life," she cried, tears finally breaking free after being held back for so long. Owen regarded her steadily, his expression softening. "Normal is overrated." Florence blinked at him through her tears. "What, normal?" he repeated. "Everyone's so concerned with having a normal life. Getting married to the right person, having the right house, the right standing in society." He gestured to the wild landscape around them. "Look at all this. Is any of it normal? The most beautiful things in this world don't fit into neat little boxes." His words hung in the air between them, and Florence found herself without a ready response. There was something profound in his simple philosophy, something that resonated with a part of her that had always felt constrained by the expectations of proper society. "I should turn in," she said finally, rising to her feet. "Thank you again, Owen, for everything." He nodded, remaining by the dying fire. "Sleep well, Florence." Inside the cabin, Florence lay awake for a long time, pondering Owen's words and the strange path that had brought her to this hidden valley. Outside, crickets sang their night songs, and somewhere an owl called sounds so different from the city noises she'd grown up with. Despite the uncertainty of her situation, she felt safer than she had in months. With that thought, Florence finally drifted into a dreamless sleep, her troubles temporarily held at bay by the protective walls of Owen's sanctuary and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who seemed to understand the value of living outside the boundaries of what others deemed normal. The next morning, Florence woke to the scent of coffee and the sound of chopping wood. She stepped outside to find Owen splitting logs with practiced efficiency, his shirt already damp with exertion despite the early hour. "Good morning," she called, approaching with a cup of coffee she'd poured from the pot on the outdoor fire. Owen paused, wiping his brow before accepting the cup. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," she admitted. "What can I do to help around here? I don't want to be a burden." Owen took a long drink before answering. "You're welcome to do whatever makes you comfortable. Garden could use some tending if you're inclined." Florence smiled. "I may have grown up in the city, but I know my way around vegetables. My mother insisted I learn practical skills alongside my piano lessons." Wise woman she was. Florence's smile turned wistful. "She died when I was 16. Consumption." Owen nodded in understanding. Death was a constant companion on the frontier, taking young and old without discrimination. They fell into a surprisingly comfortable routine over the next few days. Florence took charge of the small garden, weeding between rows of corn, beans, and potatoes. Owen hunted, tended to his horse and the 2 milk cows, and made repairs around the property. In the evenings, they shared simple meals and conversation that gradually revealed more of their respective histories. Florence learned that Owen had fought for the Union, serving as a scout rather than in the regular infantry due to his tracking skills. After the war, he drifted west, working as a ranch hand, occasional lawman, and guide before settling in this remote corner of the Texas Hill Country 3 years ago. "What made you choose this particular spot?" she asked one evening as they sat on the small porch, watching lightning flicker in distant clouds. "Found it by accident," Owen replied. "Was tracking a mountain lion that had been taking calves from a ranch near Bandera. Storm came up, much like that one brewing now, and I took shelter in that outcropping over there." He pointed to a rock formation on the hillside. "When the rain cleared, I looked down and saw this valley. Something about it just felt." He searched for the right word. "Welcoming." Florence smiled, understanding completely. Despite its isolation, or perhaps because of it, the hidden homestead had a peculiar charm that soothed the spirit. On the 5th day, Owen announced he needed to ride into a small settlement about 15 miles away for supplies and to listen for any news of bounty hunters in the area. "Will you be all right here alone?" he asked as he saddled his horse. Florence nodded, though anxiety flickered briefly across her features. "I'll be fine. How long will you be gone?" "Back by nightfall," he promised. "There's a rifle above the door if you need it." "You know how to use one, my father taught me," she confirmed. "Though I've never had occasion to shoot at anything more threatening than a paper target." Owen checked his saddlebags one last time. "Just remember, aim steady, breathe out slow, and squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." After he'd ridden away, Florence found herself acutely aware of the silence that settled over the homestead. She busied herself with chores, washing clothes in the creek, baking bread in the small oven built into the side of the fireplace, and continuing her work in the garden. Yet she couldn't help glancing up at every unfamiliar sound, her nerves strung tight with the awareness of her vulnerability. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered over the hills, promising a substantial storm. Florence hurried to bring in the laundry and secure anything that might blow away in strong winds. As she was closing the chicken coop, a sound froze her in place: hoofbeats, approaching from the east, not the south where Owen had departed. Her heart pounding, Florence slipped into the cabin and retrieved the rifle. She checked that it was loaded, just as her father had taught her years ago, then positioned herself by the window with a clear view of the approach to the cabin. Through the gathering gloom, she made out 2 riders making their way carefully down the hillside trail. They weren't moving like men who knew where they were going. These were searchers, scanning the landscape methodically. When they drew closer, Florence's blood ran cold. Even in the dim light, she recognized one of them, Harrington's personal bodyguard, a brutal man named Silas who had threatened her the night she fled. Sent Louis. Florence's mind raced. They couldn't possibly have tracked her here by chance. Someone in Bandera must have talked, perhaps noting the direction Owen had ridden with an unknown woman. She silently prayed that Owen would delay his return until these men had gone. The riders approached the cabin cautiously, and Florence shrank back from the window, keeping the rifle ready. She heard them dismount, followed by the creak of the porch steps. "Looks fresh, lived in," one voice said. "Someone's been here recently." "Check the barn," Silas ordered. "I'll take the cabin." Florence's options narrowed to a terrifying point. She could try to hide, but the cabin was too small to offer any effective concealment. She could flee out the back, but they would surely see her in the open terrain. Or she could stand her ground. The door handle turned slowly. Florence raised the rifle, her finger trembling against the trigger. The door swung open, and Silas stood framed in the doorway, momentarily backlit by the darkening sky. His expression shifted from searching to triumphant as he spotted her. "Well, well," he drawled. "Miss Crawford, Mr. Harrington will be mighty pleased I found you." "Take one step closer and I'll shoot," Florence warned, her voice steadier than she felt. Silas chuckled. "You won't. You're not a killer, Miss Crawford. Besides, that rifle's probably not even the thunderous crack of a gunshot cut him off, not from Florence's rifle, but from somewhere outside." Silas spun around just as his companion cried out and fell from the porch. A second shot followed, and Silas clutched his shoulder, blood blossoming through his shirt. "Drop the gun," Owen's voice commanded from the gathering darkness. He materialized at the edge of the clearing, his revolver aimed steadily at Silas. "Next one goes through your heart." Silas hesitated, his hand inching toward his holster. "I wouldn't," Owen advised calmly. "Miss Crawford has you covered too, and even if she's never shot a man before at this range, she can't miss." Defeated, Silas slowly raised his hands. Owen approached carefully, relieved Silas of his weapons, and bound his hands with a length of rope. "Are you hurt?" Owen asked Florence, his eyes never leaving Silas. She shook her head, lowering the rifle. "How did you know?" "Saw their tracks crossing mine about 5 miles out," Owen explained. "Recognized them as the same men from Bandera. Figured they might be headed this way." He secured Silas to a porch post as fat raindrops began to fall. "We need to talk to our guest here." The interrogation, conducted as the storm broke over the valley, revealed what Florence had feared. Harrington hadn't given up his pursuit. In fact, her continued evasion had only increased his determination to find her dead or alive. "He's offering $1,000 now," Silas admitted sullenly as rain lashed the cabin windows. "Double what's on the posters." "And he sent just the two of you?" Owen asked skeptically. Silas glared. "We're the scouts. The rest are a day behind, searching a grid pattern through the hill country. 8 men, including Harrington himself." Florence paled. "He's coming himself. Said he wants to look you in the eye when he finds you." Silas's grim smile suggested he knew exactly what that meant. Owen and Florence exchanged a glance. The situation had suddenly become much more dangerous. "What happens now?" she asked when Owen had secured Silas in the barn for the night, his wounded companion bandaged but unconscious. Owen stood by the fireplace, his expression grave as he stared into the flames. "You can't stay here. If these two don't report back, the others will follow their trail right to us." "Where can I go?" Florence's voice caught. "If he's willing to bring that many men this far." "He won't stop," Owen finished her thought. "Men like Harrington don't accept defeat." "I've brought this danger to your doorstep," she said miserably. "I'm sorry." Owen turned to her. "You have nothing to apologize for." He was silent for a moment, seemingly wrestling with a decision. "There's another option, but you may not like it. At this point, I'm open to anything. We face him, end this chase once and for all." Florence stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Face him." "Owen, there are 8 armed men with him." "7 now," he corrected with a small smile. "And they're searching unfamiliar territory in the dark during a storm." "Even so, how could we possibly?" Owen sat at the table, gesturing for her to join him. "In the war, I learned that superior numbers don't matter much if you choose the right battlefield and the right moment." He began to outline a plan so audacious that Florence could hardly believe he was serious. Yet as the night deepened and the storm raged outside, the impossibility of their situation made his proposal seem increasingly like their only option. By dawn, as the rain finally subsided, they had agreed on a desperate gambit that would either end their troubles or end their lives. "Are you sure about this?" Florence asked as they prepared to leave the cabin. "You could just walk away." This isn't your fight." Owen secured his gun belt, checking each bullet before sliding it into place. "Maybe not originally," he conceded, "but I've never been good at walking away from something that matters." His eyes met hers, and something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement that in the short time they'd known each other, something significant had changed for both of them. They rode out as the first rays of sun broke through the dissipating clouds, leaving their captives securely bound in the barn with enough water to last, until someone found them. Florence wore Owen's spare clothes, her hair tucked under a hat, riding as if she were his partner rather than a woman in distress. The transformation was remarkable. She sat tall in the saddle, every bit the frontier woman rather than the city-bred banker's daughter. Their plan required perfect timing and more than a little luck. They rode southeast, following a route that would intercept Harrington's searching party based on the information they'd extracted from Sela's. By mid-morning, they reached the position. Owen had selected a narrow pass between limestone bluffs where the trail constricted, forcing riders to proceed in single file. "This is where we make our stand," Owen said as they concealed their horses in a grove of cedars. "If Sela's was telling the truth, they'll come through here sometime around noon." Florence nodded, her mouth dry with anxiety. "And if he wasn't, then we've gained another day to plan something else." Owen helped her into position on a rocky shelf overlooking the trail. "Remember, don't fire unless absolutely necessary. The element of surprise is our only advantage." They settled in to wait, the sun climbing higher as morning stretched toward midday. Florence found herself studying Owen's profile as he kept watch on the trail below the set of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes, the quiet confidence he projected even in this desperate situation. She realized with a sudden clarity that she trusted this man with her life, despite having known him less than a week. "Owen," she said softly, "why are you really doing this?" He didn't immediately answer, his gaze still focused on the distant curve of the trail. "Everyone deserves a chance at freedom," he finally said. "To choose their own path, not have it dictated by others' greed or cruelty." He glanced at her. "Besides, I've grown rather fond of having you around." Before Florence could respond, Owen raised a hand for silence. In the distance, the faint sound of hooves and men's voices carried on the still air. Harrington's party was approaching. The next minutes unfolded with terrifying clarity. As the riders entered the pass below, Owen's plan sprang into action. They had prepared rock slides at strategic points along the trail. And now, Owen triggered the first with a well-placed shot, sending a cascade of stones tumbling down to cut off the rear of the party from the advance riders. Confusion erupted as the men scattered, some drawing weapons while others fought to control panicking horses. From their elevated position, Owen and Florence had a perfect view of the chaos. "There," Florence pointed. "The man in the black coat, that's Harrington." Owen nodded, marking the man who seemed to be shouting orders to the others. He was a corpulent figure, obviously unaccustomed to the rigors of frontier travel, but the revolver in his hand suggested he was still dangerous. "Remember the plan," Owen murmured. "We need him separated from the others." A second rock slide, this one triggered by a small charge Owen had set earlier, drove 3 of the men farther down the trail. The remaining 4, including Harrington, were now caught between the 2 blockages, exactly as Owen had hoped. What happened next unfolded with the nightmarish inevitability of an avalanche. One of Harrington's men spotted movement on the bluff and opened fire. Owen pulled Florence down just as bullets chipped stone inches from where they'd been crouching. "Time for phase 2, Owen said grimly. He fired twice in rapid succession, hitting one man in the leg and causing another to dive for cover. Florence, despite her fear, found herself admirably calm as she followed Owen along their prepared escape route, a narrow game trail that led down to the pass, but remained hidden from view from below. They moved quickly, using the confusion of the gunfire to mask their approach. When they reached the floor of the pass, they were positioned behind Harrington and his remaining men, who were still firing uselessly at their previous location on the bluff. "Harrington," Owen called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls. The men whirled, caught completely off guard by the voice from behind. Owen stood in the center of the trail, his revolver pointed steadily at Harrington's chest. Florence flanked him, rifle raised. "Who the devil are you?" Harrington demanded, his florid face contorted with rage. "The man who's ending your hunt," Owen replied evenly. "Drop your weapons, all of you." One of the men, a professional gunman by his stance, made a fatal calculation. His hand flashed toward his holster. Owen's reaction was instantaneous, a single shot that sent the man crumpling to the ground. "Anyone else feeling lucky?" Owen asked quietly. The remaining man beside Harrington carefully placed his gun on the ground. Harrington himself, however, kept his revolver pointed at Owen. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Harrington snarled. "Do you know how many lawmen I have on my payroll, how many judges? You're a dead man walking." "I don't think so," Florence said, stepping forward and removing her hat, letting her auburn hair fall free. "It's over, Harrington." Recognition and then fury crossed Harrington's features. "You little fool, you think this changes anything? You think your cowboy hero can protect you forever?" "She doesn't need protection," Owen said. "But she does deserve justice. For her father, for herself." Harrington's laugh was ugly. "Justice in this wilderness. There's only power and those who wield it." "Then perhaps it's time the balance of power shifted," Florence replied, reaching into her pocket and withdrawing a folded document. "You recognize this, don't you?" Harrington's expression faltered as he saw the papers. "Where did you get those?" "My father wasn't a fool. He kept records of every transaction, every threat, every illegal scheme you forced him into." Florence's voice gained strength with each word. "I may have fled St. Louis, but I didn't leave empty-handed." "Those papers won't help you if you're dead," Harrington said, his finger tightening on the trigger of his revolver. "I wouldn't," Owen warned. "Even if you manage to shoot one of us, the other will ensure you never leave this pass alive." A tense silence fell, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Harrington's eyes darted between Florence and Owen, calculating his odds. "What do you want?" he finally asked, defeat creeping into his voice. "First, you're going to drop that gun," Florence instructed. When Harrington hesitated, she added, "Now." The revolver fell to the dust. "Second, you're going to sign a confession," Florence continued, producing a second document from her pocket, one she and Owen had prepared the night before. "Admitting to your crimes, clearing my name, and acknowledging your role in my father's disappearance." "You expect me to sign my own ruin?" Harrington scoffed. "I expect you to choose between ruin and death," Owen replied matter-of-factly. "Only one of those options leaves you breathing." Another silence, heavier than the first, and then, Harrington finally asked, "Then you leave Texas," Florence said. "Never return, never send men after me again. The confession stays sealed unless you break those terms." "How do I know you won't use it anyway?" "You don't," Florence admitted. "You'll have to trust that I have more honor than you." The irony of the statement wasn't lost on any of them. Slowly, with obvious reluctance, Harrington nodded his agreement. The next hours were a careful dance of tension and distrust, as Harrington signed the confession under Owen's watchful eye. His remaining men were disarmed, but allowed to keep their horses. Owen made it clear that any attempt to double-cross them would end poorly for all involved. By sunset, it was done. Harrington and his surviving men rode south with explicit instructions never to return to this part of Texas again. The bounty on Florence would be publicly withdrawn. Her name cleared through channels Harrington still controlled in St. Louis. As they watched the party disappear into the gathering dusk, Florence felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden she'd carried for so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stand straight and unburdened. "You think he'll honor the agreement?" she asked as they mounted their own horses for the journey back to Owen's homestead. "Men like Harrington respect only one thing: self-preservation," Owen replied. "As long as breaking his word costs more than keeping it, he'll behave." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the events of the day settling around them like dust after a stampede. "What will you do now?" Owen finally asked. "You're free to return to St. Louis if you wish. Reclaim your life there." Florence considered this as they crested a rise that gave them a view of the star-scattered sky emerging above the hills. "I'm not sure that life exists anymore," she said thoughtfully. "Or if I even wanted to. No," she shook her head. "The Florence Crawford who belonged in St. Louis society feels like a different person now, like someone I used to know." She glanced at Owen, a small smile playing at her lips. "Besides, I've grown rather fond of this wild, unnormal life." The corner of Owen's mouth twitched upward. "Have you now?" "I have," she confirmed. "Though I suspect it would be considerably less appealing without certain company." Owen reined his horse to a stop, turning in his saddle to face her directly. "Florence Crawford, are you suggesting you might want to stay out here in this uncivilized wilderness?" "I'm suggesting," she said carefully, "that perhaps I've found something worth staying for." The look they exchanged contained volumes: questions and answers, fears and hopes, and something new and fragile that had grown between them in the chaos of the past week. "Well then," Owen said finally, his voice rough with emotion he rarely displayed, "I suppose we should get home before it gets too dark. Lots to do tomorrow if we're going to make that cabin suitable for extended company." Florence's smile widened. "Lead the way, Mr. Eastwood." They returned to the homestead well after midnight, tired but victorious. The next days were filled with a different kind of activity, not the desperate preparations of fugitives, but the hopeful work of people building something new together. Florence sent letters to her few remaining allies in St. Louis, arranging for the sale of her father's remaining properties and the transfer of funds to a bank in San Antonio. Owen expanded the garden, began construction on an addition to the cabin, and introduced Florence to neighbors who lived scattered across the surrounding hills: hardy, independent families who valued privacy, but welcomed a newcomer without too many questions about her past. Weeks stretched into months. Summer's heat gave way to the golden light of autumn. The hidden valley transformed under Florence's influence. Curtains appeared in windows. Flowers grew alongside vegetables in the garden, and the interior of the cabin became a blend of frontier practicality and touches of the refinement she'd brought from her former life. Owen watched these changes with quiet amusement and growing affection. He found himself looking forward to evenings by the fire, listening to Florence read aloud from one of his books or sharing stories of their vastly different upbringings. What had begun as an impulsive act of rescue had evolved into something neither of them had expected to find in the rugged hill country: partnership, understanding, and eventually, love. It was a crisp November evening when Owen finally gave voice to what had been building between them. They sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of amber and gold. "I've been thinking," he began, uncharacteristically hesitant. A dangerous pastime, Florence teased, though her expression was attentive. This place, it was just somewhere to exist before, somewhere to be left alone. Owen gazed out at the valley that had changed so much in recent months. Now it feels like more, like home, Florence suggested softly. Yes. He turned to her, his customary reserve giving way to an openness that made her breath catch. Because of you. Florence's eyes glistened in the fading light. Owen. I'm not a man of fancy words, he continued. Never saw much use for them before. But I find myself wishing I had some now to tell you properly what you've come to mean to me. I think you're doing just fine, she whispered. Owen reached into his pocket, withdrawing something small that he held carefully in his palm. I rode to San Antonio last week, not just for supplies. Florence's eyes widened as he opened his hand to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl set in its center. It's not what you might have had in St. Louis, he said apologetically. Not diamonds or, it's perfect, Florence interrupted, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. I can't promise you an easy life, Owen continued. Can't promise you'll ever have the comforts or standing you had before, but I can promise you'll never be alone again, never have to run again. He took her hand in his. Florence Crawford, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Her answer came not in words but in action as she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, their first kiss, filled with the promise of countless more to come. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, her smile was radiant. Yes, she said simply. 1,000 times yes. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Bandera, with only a handful of neighbors as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, the celebration afterward modest but joyful. As they drove the wagon back to their hidden valley that evening, now as husband and wife, Florence looked at the man beside her with a sense of wonder at how completely her life had transformed. "What are you thinking?" Owen asked, noticing her gaze. "I was thinking about that night we met," she replied, "when I cried that I could never have a normal life." Owen's expression softened with memory. "And I told you normal was overrated. You were right." Florence leaned against his shoulder, contentment warming her even against the November chill. "This life, our life, may never be what society considers normal, but I wouldn't trade it for all the normalcy in the world." Owen's arm tightened around her. "Nor would I, Mrs. Eastwood, nor would I." The years that followed proved that happiness often comes in unexpected forms. Florence and Owen built a life together in their hidden valley that blended the best of their different worlds. The cabin expanded to a proper home as their family grew, first with the birth of their son James in 1877, followed by twin daughters Sarah and Elizabeth in 1879. Florence never entirely abandoned her city roots. She established a small school that served the scattered children of the hill country, bringing education to families who had previously gone without. Owen's reputation as a fair and honorable man spread throughout the region, and he occasionally served as a guide for travelers or assisted the Bandera sheriff when situations required his tracking skills. They faced hardships, as all frontier families did, drought years that tested their resilience, illness that brought fear into their otherwise happy home, occasional encounters with men from both their pasts that required courage and wits to navigate. Yet through it all, they faced each challenge together, their bond only strengthening with each obstacle overcome. On their 10th anniversary, Owen surprised Florence with a proper piano, a logistical miracle that had required coordination with merchants from San Antonio, and a team of determined men to transport the instrument over the rugged terrain to their home. "How on earth did you manage this?" Florence gasped when the piano was finally positioned in their front room. Owen shrugged, pleased by her reaction. Called in some favors. Figured after 10 years of putting up with me, you deserved something from your old life. Florence ran her fingers reverently over the keys before turning back to him with tears in her eyes. My old life gave me nothing as precious as what I've found here with you. That evening, after the children were asleep, the hidden valley resonated with music for the first time as Florence played melodies she'd carried in her memory for a decade. Owen sat beside her on the bench, entranced not just by the music, but by the joy it brought to the woman he loved, a woman who had fled in desperation and found strength she never knew she possessed, who had transformed a solitary existence into a home filled with love and purpose. As the final notes faded into the night, Florence leaned her head against Owen's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "For the piano?" he asked, kissing the top of her head. "For everything," she clarified. "For saving me that night in Bandera. For showing me that life outside the bounds of what's expected could be so much richer than I ever imagined." Owen turned her face up to his, the love of a decade reflected in his eyes. "You saved me too, you know. I just didn't realize I needed saving until you arrived." Florence smiled, thinking of the solitary, taciturn man she'd first met, and how he'd gradually opened himself to love and family and joy, changes as profound as her own transformation from society daughter to frontier woman. "To think," she mused, "all of this began because I was convinced I could never have a normal life." Owen's low chuckle rumbled through his chest. "Normal would have been a terrible waste of our potential, Mrs. Eastwood." "Indeed it would, Mr. Eastwood," Florence agreed, reaching up to kiss him as the moonlight spilled through the window of the home they'd built together, a sanctuary of love in the wilderness where two souls had found exactly the life they were meant to live, far beyond the confining boundaries of normal.